You will often read about the tragic hero. Now, the tragic hero is an idea which, in my view, is a mistake. There's no such thing as a tragic hero. The word hero is never applied in tragedy to a living person. Aristotle, in his Poetics, the first theoretical account of tragedy, doesn't mention any hero. The tragic hero is an invention of Renaissance critics. And having once been established, it's taken on an extraordinary life of its own. So all those 19th century discussions of tragedy, Hegel, Nietzsche, and so on, all talk about the tragic hero. And again, 20th century discussion of tragedy, masses of it is about the tragic hero. But the idea of a tragic hero is a mistake. There's no such thing as a tragic hero. It obscures the real meaning of tragedy. It implies that these individuals of tragedy are in some sense heroic, flawed, yes, but somehow heroic. Well, that's never said. But they are described in a certain way constantly, which is through the word tyrannos, which means an autocrat or tyrant. Our word tyrant comes from the Greek tyrannos. Now, tyrant isn't a perfect translation of tyrannos. It's a bit more derogatory than tyrannos. But nevertheless, it's the closest we can get to translating the Greek word tyrannos. Now, the Athenian audience had a collective memory of tyranny because in the 6th century BC, Athens was under a tyranny. That is to say, an autocratic rule by a family. Pisistratus seized power, and power was then inherited by his son, Hippias, who eventually, towards the end of the 6th century, was expelled, and that was the point at which the Athenians instituted democracy. It was also the time at which tragedy started to come into being. And throughout the 5th century, the Athenians were very fearful of the restoration of tyranny. Hippias had left Athens, but he was still active against Athens. And we have plenty of evidence of this. For example, in the festival of the city-state, at which the tragedies were performed, the city Dionysia, every year, it seems, a proclamation was read out offering a reward to anybody who killed the tyrannoi, the tyrants, the family of the Athenian tyrannical rulers. And moreover, we know that in the Peloponnesian War, and the Oedipus Tyrannus may well have been produced in the Peloponnesian War, we know that the Athenians were obsessed with fear of tyranny being restored. We know that from Thucydides, we know it from Aristophanes. So this should change our conception of tragedy, it seems to me, that these mighty individuals are regularly called by a word which was anathema to the democratically minded Athenian audience, namely they were tyrannoi, they were tyrants, they were not heroes. And the tradition of calling them heroes is in a sense to depoliticize Athenian tragedy, to think of it in terms which are somehow politically safer or politically neutral. Well, the Greeks would not have agreed with that. A tyrannos was a tyrannos. The Oedipus by Sophocles contains the word tyrannos, or its cognates, 15 times. So it's there all the way through. Incidentally, the play is sometimes called the Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king, and sometimes called Oedipus Tyrannos, Oedipus the tyrant, and I think it's better to call it Oedipus the Tyrannos. Well, what was the difference between a king and a tyrant? Well, a king was somebody who had legitimately inherited the royal power, whereas a tyrant was somebody who had acquired the royal power through intelligence, through a coup, had become sovereign simply by seizing power. Now, the tyrant could, like Pisistratus at Athens, bequeath the power to their son and establish a dynasty, but tyranny was always something which originally at least had been illegitimately acquired by money, by force, by intelligence, and so on. Another feature of the tyranny, and again Thucydides mentions this, is that it was ambivalent. That is to say, there was a tradition that Pisistratus and his son Hippias at Athens in the 6th century BC had benefited the city. They had acted fairly constitutionally, and they had performed all the sacrifices, and we know that they were responsible for a building program at Athens. They were concerned with the polis, the city-state, as you would expect. At the same time, the tyranny became very repressive and in the end was replaced by a democracy. Now, another feature that you find in a whole number of texts about what the tyrannos was like is that the tyrannos was likely to fall out with close family members, so that, for example, Polycrates, the tyrant of Samos, exiled one brother and killed another, well, simply because he wanted to exercise power all by himself. And this is a general feature of the accounts given of tyrants. They're obsessed with wealth and getting enough wealth to rule, and they tend to kill their kin or get rid of them in some way. And they also tend to pervert the sacred, and they will use ritual, for example, simply in order to get power. So in Herodotus, Plato and others, there's a kind of typical picture of a tyrant. And they also tend to have a certain kind of character. So you see this, for example, in the play Prometheus, attributed to Aeschylus, where Zeus is clearly like a tyrannos. He doesn't trust people who are close to him. And similarly, the tyrants, as you'd expect, are very suspicious of people who are close to them because they think that those people are trying to replace them and to seize power. They also tend to be very irascible. They get angry easily. Now, if you think about Oedipus in the Oedipus Tyrannus, he actually embodies all these characteristics. I mean, he seized power through his intelligence, and marrying the queen, he wasn't, at least it wasn't known that he was in fact the son of the previous king. That was only discovered later. So he would be thought to be a classic tyrannos. He's ambivalent in the sense that on the one hand, he really is concerned with the well-being of the polis. Like in the prologue, he says he's going to do everything to solve the problem of the plague, and he's very energetic and active in promoting the well-being of the polis, just as Pisistratus was. But on the other hand, he has anger. He was so angry that he killed a stranger on the way to Thebes, who turned out to be his father. He's angry in the play against Creon, against Tiresias, in what seems to be an irrational manner. And he's also very suspicious of those close to him. He thinks that Creon is plotting to replace him and become a ruler himself. So that Oedipus is the classic tyrannos. And this is a political dimension of the play that is constantly ignored in interpretations of it. But it also can be applied to many other Athenian tragedies, so that another classic tyrannos, for example, is Creon in the Antigone, who acts in a way very like Oedipus, or Pentheus in the Bacchae. In all three plays, in the end, the polis, the city-state, gets rid of the tyrannos, and of course the tyrannos suffers immensely, and we should feel pity for them. I'm sure the audience did feel pity for Oedipus, of course, for Pentheus, for Creon, and many others. But we shouldn't forget at the same time that this pity is also ambivalent in the sense that the community has undoubtedly benefited from the self-destruction of the tyrannical family. It may not be made explicit, but we must always bear in mind that for the Athenian audience, these were not heroes. They were tyrants, and they would inevitably feel ambivalent, not just about the character of these people, but also about their status as the tyrannoi which the Athenian audience detested and feared.